Hello, ICICLE friends. It's Shubhi Sinha again with Indiana University. I'm back with more tips on AI ethics. Today's topic is fairness. If you've spent any time thinking about systemized fairness or unfairness, you know it's a complicated one. So, let's talk about fairness and what it means to democratize AI. Remember how we talked about social ordering being a characteristic of infrastructure? If not, here's a quick refresher. Ethical issues arise from infrastructure too. Infrastructure, simply put, is the technologies and systems necessary for society to function. And since social order relies on infrastructure, when it is not representative or democratic, it can also exacerbate inequalities. This creates a challenge when building cyber infrastructure. We know that there are a lot of places where fairness can be an issue. From sensors collecting data to outcomes on human, animal, and environmental health, and all the processes in between. In short, models, data, and outcomes should all be fair, but there is no single standard of fairness. Most philosophical measures of fairness involve some notion of a trade-off. For example, procedural fairness accepts some inequality as long as participation was open to all, but does not permit unequal treatment. Luck egalitarianism and prioritarianism attempt to even out the circumstances between the resource-rich and the poor. In the case of prioritarianism, prioritizing resource allocation to those who are worse off is an acceptable form of inequality. Environmental ethics values the well-being of non-human and human animals and ecosystems. Based on a welfare or equality of outcome notion, there is no trade-off. All members should get the same outcome, and/or no one should be worse off. Organizations typically hold a particular philosophical perspective on acceptable and unacceptable inequalities because they are guided by their own perspectives, purposes, and stakeholder relationships. Consequently, contrary perspectives, players, and stakeholders end up worse off. For example, an organization that values socioeconomic equality may disadvantage non-human animals and environmental concerns. Unfair outcomes often result from not understanding a stakeholder's position. For example, interviews with farmers established that some found it unfair that they must relinquish the data generated by their labor in order to take advantage of the democratization of precision agriculture. A 2022 study brought to light how even the labeling data for AI can inflict harm on animals. The categorization used to label animals in ImageNet embodies the human-held belief that all other animal species are inferior. This is particularly true for farmed animals. The philosophy of fairness suggests that when animals are seen as inferior, their health as a species in an environmental ecosystem is at risk. And unfair outcomes result from taking the domain expert out of the loop, as was the case when an ML model misinterpreted a pattern in the data and falsely classified patients with asthma as having a lower chance of dying from pneumonia, potentially delaying diagnosis. Domain experts with first-hand knowledge identified the failure and intervened. Inevitably, designers and programmers will build systems for life experiences that they haven't had. Sometimes, without even realizing it, they are in a position of making critical decisions about fairness trade-offs without having a good understanding of the consequences. So, what can we do to minimize the risk of unfair outcomes from our work? Here we go. So, tip number 1 is to involve communities impacted by the systems in the development of the systems. Use democratic ideals to identify these communities. Deciding who is involved must not just be an exercise in serving those close at hand. Engage participants, gather their feedback, and incorporate it in a meaningful way. Tip number 2 is to ensure that stakeholders with less power and resources are not further marginalized by AI or the cyber infrastructure that supports AI. Some ways to do this are by adding measures to ensure that end users have control over their data, and by testing to see if algorithms discriminate against particular groups. Tip number 3 is to think about where you are in the trade-off matrix. Boxing yourself into one paradigm can blind you to inequalities. Thinking broadly about stakeholders can help you see the impact of your work on human, non human, and environmental welfare. As we innovate in both AI and cyber infrastructure for AI in ways centered on ethics, we've now added some tips for advancing fairness. These are outward facing requirements, meaning, depending on our role in ICICLE, we need to either engage with or research about stakeholder needs to bring about fair outcomes. All right, iCyclists, that's all for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.